Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, I do congratulate Senator Larissa Waters for her strong campaigning for the environment and for bringing to this parliament this important private members' bill about retaining federal approval powers. It is certainly what is needed, and the speeches that we have heard from Coalition and Labor senators reminds us of how important this legislation is. It's very interesting to hear how similar those speeches are. When it comes to considering how we strengthen environmental protection, we see the Coalition and Labor really involved in quite an ugly collaboration. Now, despite the statements that we've heard from Senators Cameron, Birmingham and McDonald, we obviously know that there's people from other parties who enjoy the environment. We're not denying that. That's just ridiculous. It's just a red herring. What's being addressed here is about protecting the environment. And those speakers, Mr Cameron, Senator Cameron, Senator Birmingham, Senator McDonald, who had a very similar theme to their speeches, they're just avoiding dealing with the all-important issue is how we tighten up the protection. Because what we've seen under successive federal and state governments is these laws being weakened. And that's why Senator Larissa Waters' bill is so important. The Greens strongly oppose the Coalition and the Labor government ganging up to hand over federal responsibility for protecting our national environment to state governments that are so often pro-mining, pro-logging, pro-shooting in national parks, haven't got the commitment to ensuring that the all-important green corridors are there, are not standing up to the big end of town who so often put their profits before the all-important environmental protection. They're not actually committed to working to get the balance right. And when you have governments like that that are just opening the door to those companies, it's clearly time to look at the laws closely. And thank heavens we have this bill before us. Because we know the current environmental laws are failing us. We've already lost valuable places and endangered wildlife species due to rapid and damaging developments surrounding these precious places. And I've seen that up close in New South Wales, and again it was where we saw a very ugly cooperation between Labor and the coalition parties, weakening planning laws in New South Wales to allow rampant development, often in areas of important environmental significance. And it's worth putting on the record the one aspect of that planning law that became so notorious in New South Wales was called Part 3A. Now, as we would all know in this place, we might be working on legislation, but once you're out mixing with the public, people rarely know parts of an act. But Part 3A became very well known amongst the public. People knew what that was meant to their local area. It was virtually, they didn't have community consultation was ended, gave this enormous power to the minister, the planning minister of the day, where he or she didn't even need to take advice from their own Director General. And that was a change to the planning laws brought in under the cooperation of Labor and the Coalition. And that's what is a theme of environmental protection in this country in recent times, and we're seeing it very clearly and very blatantly in this debate of the cooperation between these two parties. Now, we need to strengthen national environmental protection, but instead Minister Burke is preparing to hand over his responsibilities to state governments. Now, the minister, under the EPBC Act of 1999, has the power to protect places and animals that we know are so important to Australians. People value our wildlife. They love our precious places, our natural environment. And we also know that the law that provides the protection is already minimal, already provides very little protection. But we can't go backwards, and that is what this important bill that we're debating today addresses. Because Australia faces a biodiversity crisis, and history shows that state governments can't be trusted to step in and deal with and stem this crisis. Neither can they be trusted to act in the best interest of protecting our precious places. What we see is that they continue to place commercial interests before the interests of the environment. And I obviously acknowledge we have to get the balance right here, but there isn't a balance at the moment. Protecting the environment needs to become a priority for government, because we can develop greater jobs growth, greater productivity, if we have that environmental protection in place. Otherwise, the damage to our communities becomes so severe that it is all out of balance. Again, I would like to look at examples from my own state. Here, national parks are under real threat of losing their conservation status. The Coalition Government in New South Wales have decided to open up 79 national parks, nature reserves and conservation areas for recreational shooting and hunting. Now, this has been on the record, but we always need to repeat it because it's, again, an ugly part of how politics is playing out in this country, where the Coalition in New South Wales, Liberals and Nationals, have done a very dodgy deal with shooters. They've got some of their legislation through, and in turn they're giving the shooters what they want. At the moment, what they wanted was shooting in national parks. They also want to open up, make it easier for young people to shoot. So that's something that they want to push through. But for the moment, let's look at the environmental issues here. What we also need to remember is that the Labor also have their fingerprints all over this issue of shooting in quite pristine environmental areas in New South Wales, because it was Labor who started the deals with the Shooters Party. They opened up state forests in the first instance to shooting to allow hunting in those areas. And we heard some ridiculous comments from Senator Ian McDonald that the Greens aren't working on feral animal controls. We are very committed to controlling feral animals, and we've always said that it needs to be done on an evidence-based, with an evidence-based approach, using professionals. What the Coalition, what Senator Ian McDonald's party is doing, they're actually setting back the work to protect, to control feral animals, because it's been undertaken in a way that's now been shown that often results in feral animals proliferating, because these recreational hunters are not interested in taking out all the animals. They don't have the expertise of how to do that, and there's been examples of where they will leave some of the stock so they can come back and continue their hunting expeditions on another weekend. The New South Wales Government is also pushing to plan to develop Newcastle's fourth coal export terminal called T4. Now, again, we see here collaboration between Labor and the Coalition. In the Hunter regions, there are already dozens of coal mines. There's many more proposed. This proposed new coal loader, which is clearly not needed, but it's been pushed ahead to help fast-track the opening up of these new coal mines, and the approval process for those coal mines is very much linked with the go-ahead being given for this T4 terminal. Now, as well as being linked to this new coal infrastructure if it was built, as well as being linked to driving a greater health burden through excessive air pollution on local people, what we know would also happen is that there would be enormous damage in the wonderful Hunter estuary to really important homes for the bird populations in that area. I had the opportunity recently to fly over this area in a helicopter inspection trip, and it is really world-class. Much of it has been recognised as Ramsar wetlands. But interestingly, not all of it. And that becomes quite worrying, because areas that I've been informed, and I was shown these areas that should have been included when some of these areas were listed as Ramsar wetlands, and therefore requiring Australia to provide protection under international treaties. You start to wonder why were some of the areas left out, areas that are now marked for a coal loader. It certainly seems very unusual and has raised many suspicions amongst local people. Was a deal done on this is a question that's been put to me. The New South Wales Government is now waiting for the go-ahead from the Commonwealth Government, who has to assess the impact of T4 on these valuable wetlands under the EPBC Act. And again, just to spell out how significant these areas are, hundreds of thousands of birds migrate to Australia even from the Arctic. So they're very small birds. I find it quite amazing. They fly so far. They have stopovers in Korea and Japan as they fly down. They arrive at the Hunter Estuary. They're already finding that much of their habitat has already been covered by other developments, and now one very important piece of wetland could be destroyed if this T4 project goes ahead. BirdLife International has designated part of this area as an IBA, that stands for Important Bird Area. The Hunter Estuary is widely recognised as the most important migratory shore bird site in New South Wales, and that's already despite the enormous development that's occurred in the area. So you can imagine what it would have been like originally when it was in its pristine condition, if it's still recognised as the most important area for wetland birds along the New South Wales coast and across New South Wales. As I said, this area isn't included in the Ramsar listing, and again I want to give emphasis to that because I will be back in this area on Saturday. There is a big community protest about the T4, and I know that again I'll be questioned about it. People are quite shocked that an area right beside habitat that is Ramsar listed, and this area is worthy of Ramsar listing, for some reason it isn't, and people are really wanting answers on that. T4 would also see, if it went T4 or this fourth coal loader, if it went ahead, would also result in the loss of more feeding and nesting sites for resident shorebirds in the Hunter Estuary. They're the birds that are not migratory, that live there all the time. So again, further impacts, very significant impacts on the bird life in this area, and it really is simply unacceptable. The Australian government has contractual obligations with China, Japan and Korea to protect these migratory shorebirds and their habitat. That's actually a wonderful cooperation between countries that are in this flight route of these amazing birds that fly from one end of the world to the other, and we might be about to destroy their key areas where many of them breed and also feed to replenish for the long flight back. We also need to comply with the Bonn Convention for the Protection of Migratory Wild Animals, not to mention our own EPBC Act. But what we see here is that the federal government, again, too often drag the chain, and this is where they really do need to do the right thing and reject the destruction of these wetlands. And I think when we consider what's happening, like that's just one example. We're hearing from other Green senators about the problems faced in their state. It's a real reminder of what would happen if the federal government handed over their EPBC responsibilities to state governments who are just so cavalier about environmental protection. I have no doubt that we will see more environmentally damaging projects go ahead if that's where this heads. The New South Wales government has not only failed in terms of the developments in the Hunter, we've seen it fail in many other developments, and a real standout is with regard to the habitat of the koala. They've facilitated the destruction of large tracts of valuable koala habitat. We've seen that in the approval of mines like Maules Creek coal mine in northwest New South Wales, massive housing developments, and also in forestry plans that have been allowed to go ahead. Now, people, again, particularly from overseas, they cannot believe that we do so much damage to the koala's habitat. People know in this day and age that species can't survive without their habitat being intact, without those corridors so they can move, the populations can intermingle, and you can have a healthy population that is able to expand. But we have environmental laws that don't protect the koala habitat. And now Minister Burke wants to give away his powers to protect koalas and other species to state governments, even though those very governments have already failed to protect koalas. This is a huge issue for us in New South Wales because we have a number of significant koala populations on the southeast where I was recently. They actually are now thinking there might be a new subspecies of koala in that area that is bigger than other koalas. It's more furry, and I'm very interested to hear more about it. But again, these people are so shocked that to hear that the little protection that is in place could be further wound back. And it's worth remembering comments back in 1999 of our current Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, obviously before she was Prime Minister and before when they were in opposition. And at that time, she opposed passing environmental protection responsibilities to the states. And it's worth remembering her words. States with track record of environmental vandalism like Victoria. She identified that states like that couldn't be trusted. But sadly, Labor's come into power and nothing much has changed. And that is really deeply troubling, and again a reminder of the serious problems that we have, because Labor and the Coalition are so similar when it comes to dealing with the environment. Getting that protection in place is really hard when they are just so weak on this most critical issue for the 21st century. Protecting the natural environment is vital for the health of our own communities. One goes hand in hand with the others, and at the moment we're seeing a failure from this Labor government. The Greens do strongly oppose the government's plan to pass responsibility for protecting the natural environment to state governments. And the Australian community is with the Greens on this one. People understand how important this issue is. We can't afford to let the government get in bed with the Coalition and water down environmental laws. This is just too important. We need to act, and act together. It is an issue for the environment, for our communities, for the national interest. Because if we don't, we actually jeopardise the future of our most precious asset, the natural environment. That is something we are all a part of. Thank you, Mr. President.